to Return to Home with Michele Broxton, where we go back 100 years to our great-grandma's kitchen where she made our recipe favorites, probably over a wood stove. Today in our farm kitchen, I'm so glad you joined us. We're going to make homemade mayonnaise, and then we're going to put that mayonnaise in a 3-layer chocolate cake. Let's get started. Once you make homemade mayonnaise, you might never get store-bought mayonnaise again. Let's make it together, and then we're going to put it in our 3-layer chocolate cake. The first thing you need is a light flavored oil. We're going to use 1 cup of olive oil. You can also use canola or sunflower oil. We're also going to use a tablespoon of Dijon mustard. There's probably a fancier way to say that, but you know what I mean. We're going to use a tablespoon of white wine vinegar, a tablespoon or half of a lemon juice, and just so that you know, I think we should take the seeds out before we get started. I tend to end up with lemon seeds in everything. So we'll just squeeze this lemon right in. Perfect. This is a very juicy lemon, so I'm not going to squeeze the whole thing in. I might put that in my ice water later. And then we're going to put 1/4 teaspoon of salt in this. Now we may add more later to taste, but we'll start with 1/4 teaspoon. Perfect. Next, we'll add 1 egg. Now, if you have a food processor or a blender, you can sure do this in a food processor or a blender. If you don't, you can just use a whisk. You can also use your mixer. I prefer to just use a whisk. We're going to whisk this all together until it looks like mayonnaise. I'll see you back here in just a few minutes. Now that we've made our homemade mayonnaise, let's start on our 3-layer chocolate mayonnaise cake. Now, if you've never had a mayonnaise cake, I am so excited you're here today. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a cup of hot, strong coffee. You want about 1.5 cups to start with. And if you need a cup of coffee yourself, go ahead and make one. You'll enjoy it with the cake. So we're going to add our hot coffee to our cocoa, and we're going to let that sit for about 20 minutes while we make the rest of our cake. Cocoa really has a hard time getting wet, and that's why we want to go ahead and get this process started with hot coffee so that it can soak up that hot coffee in this bowl. So we'll whisk this together, and it takes a little bit of stirring. Make sure and clean off the sides of your bowl. And you just want to whisk it until there's no lumps left. And it's a nice smooth consistency. I tell you, the smell of coffee and chocolate just go together so nicely. That's perfect. Now we'll set that aside. And now let's get started on the rest of our cake. Next, we'll add 3 cups of flour. This is just regular all-purpose flour. 1, 2, 3. Now remember my trick for keeping count of how many scoops of flour you have in your bowl. Make sure you make little piles so you can go back and count if you get distracted. And always leave a little gap at the top if you're scooping out like I did, so you don't overmeasure your flour. Next, we'll add a pinch of salt. And we'll add our baking soda and our baking powder. Now for exact measurements on all this, you're more than welcome to go to returntohome.org and find all of our recipes from today's show, along with instructions. and some troubleshooting. So like if your mayonnaise didn't turn out exactly the way you wanted it to, we've got some troubleshooting there for you as well. We'll whisk all that together, and now we're ready for the next step. Next, we'll add our eggs and our sugar to our bowl. If you can think of it, go ahead and set your eggs out and try to get them to room temperature at the beginning of starting this little project today. It'll make your cake raise a little easier and get light and fluffy. Now let's add our granulated sugar. Perfect. And we'll just break up our egg yolks and whisk this together until it's thoroughly combined. You can also do this in your electric mixer if you'd like. Either way is totally fine. You want to beat this for about 4 minutes. Once this is thoroughly mixed, we're going to move on to the next step. Next, let's add in our homemade mayonnaise. I'm smelling that chocolate and our cafe aroma coffee over in our other bowl, and it just smells so yummy. I think I might have to make myself another cup. Cafe aroma is my favorite way to start the day. They have a premium roast coffee that is just delightful. You know, you'd think that the little bit of Dijon mustard that we put in this mayonnaise would be a little much for a chocolate cake, but it just gives it enough of a tang. Kind of like how we put lemon and citrus in fruit. You wouldn't think it'd be great, but it's amazing. So we'll combine this, and then we're gonna start mixing all of our cake ingredients together. Look how nice and creamy that looks. Oh, I just can't wait for you to try this. So delicious. Now let's start adding in more ingredients. Now, we'll make a spot in the middle of our flour and start adding all of our wet ingredients in. First, our egg mixture. Perfect. Next, our coffee and chocolate. That just smells so good. Everything in this is thoroughly cooked, so if you feel the need to taste it to make sure it's okay, that would be just fine. Wonderful. Now, using our wooden spatula, we're going to start stirring this together. Can you see the marble in that cake that's starting to begin? So gorgeous. I hope you really love this cake. It's so moist and delicious. We're going to make this chocolate mayonnaise cake as a 3-layer cake, but you can also make it in a sheet pan if you'd like. What we'll do next is we're going to mix this together thoroughly, and I'm going to make it in 3 8-inch pans today. We'll bake it for 35 minutes until the toothpick comes out almost clean, and then I'll see you right back here in 35 minutes. Now that our cake is cooled and ready, I've also made us some chocolate buttercream icing. Let's get started. Now, in order to make our cake lay flat and not be humped over on the top, I like to cut off this round part. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but my kids like to eat it and so do I. If you want to make a fancy 4-layer cake, you can also cut this cake in half, right down the middle. There are tools that you can use to make this part of the process absolutely perfect. And if you'd like to be more exacting with this, you can get one of those tools off of our Amazon shop. So now that we have this part completed, let's put on our first layer of buttercream. Now, if you ever make your buttercream the day before and it gets a little stiff on you, it's really no problem. All you have to do is put in a few drops of water and mix it again, and it gets soft right away. Now, there's different ways that you make icing. One is for frosting a cake, and another is for frosting cupcakes. And you can find more information about that through our email newsletter and on our blog. There's a lot of fancy tools that you can use to ice a cake. I use a butter knife. There really is no right or wrong way to do a cake. And I will tell you, I'm not a fancy cake maker. I'm a good cake maker. Now, we're gonna spread this out, and I put it just until I can see it on the edge of the cake. I like to put a piece of parchment paper down because I don't have one of those fancy turn things, and it helps me turn the cake. Now, this mayonnaise cake is really soft, so we do need to be a little bit careful with it, especially since we cut the crusty top part off. Now, what we're looking for with this middle layer is that we ultimately get it fairly even so that the next layer sits evenly as well. A broken cake isn't a catastrophe. It's gonna taste the same, I assure you, especially with some homemade ice cream. Now, let's put our next layer on. So that we don't shake the cake we've already made, I think I'll go ahead and cut this layer right where it is. Perfect. Just doesn't get much better than that, not for a homemade cake. Now, I think I'll switch over to my spatula for a moment because we're gonna put on quite a bit more icing. Some people put on a crumb coating first. I don't. Not when I'm doing a homemade cake for my family. Now, if you're in a bakery and you're making fancy cakes, that's not what we're doing here. We're making a homemade cake for our family. I like to start with a pile in the middle and then work my way out. Now, the frosting doesn't scoot, so because you've got crumbs on the bottom. So you're just pushing the top layer of frosting. But once it touches the cake, it's going to stick to crumbs. My mom makes the prettiest little swirls on her cake. And I always wondered, how does she do that? And she just makes all these little dips and drizzles with her knife. And I think maybe that's why I love using a butter knife so much, is because it reminds me of how my mom makes cakes. Now let's just check to see how that looks. Perfect. Now you can do this a couple different ways. You can go ahead and you can ice the whole outside of your cake, or you can leave it kind of a naked cake and put just a thin coating on the outside. I really don't like a ton of icing on the outside of my cake. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do little puffs, just like my mom does, all over the cake. And then let's sprinkle some chocolate chips. Just a few. There really is no right or wrong way to make a cake, as long as you're happy with it in the end and it's going to taste the way you like it to taste. I love being in the kitchen with you, and I'm so glad that you joined me today for these 100-year-old homemade great grandma recipes. Today, we made homemade mayonnaise and we put it in our chocolate mayonnaise cake. It just doesn't get much better than that. Thank you so much for joining me today for Return to Home with Michele Broxton. Join us online at returntohome.org or email me at hello@ozarkfarms.org.